And goodness me, a lot has changed since we last spoke a few months ago. We've seen Israel get senior leaders in Hamas and Hezbollah. We've seen the UNRWA being banned by Israel. And we've also seen a highly consequential American election. So I really want to talk to you about all these things, Einat, and get your thoughts and analysis on all these developments. And then at the end, I want to welcome questions from you, the viewers, to pose them directly to Einat. But the first thing that I want to do is, for those who aren't so familiar with you, and we discussed this in our original discussion, is could you just briefly outline your political journey that has happened, particularly in the last year? Because you said that, you know, you kind of, and that's how we titled this discussion today, that you kind of have been on a journey from having a certain hypothesis, as you put it, about how to solve the Israeli-Arab, Israel-Palestine conflict. And then I don't know whether it wasn't already building for under the surface, but October 7th led to a conclusion that your hypothesis is not true. So could you talk us through that journey that you've been on?
So actually, October 7th very much confirmed the alternative hypothesis that I had already formulated at least a decade or 2 decades before. The process, the original hypothesis that I had, known as the one of the Israeli peace camp, then one that was known as Land for Peace, was basically quite simple. It is the one that said that the only thing that separates us, Israel, and peace is essentially a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And more broadly, the idea of land for peace, that if Israel would hand over lands that it came to possess as a result of its victory in the Six-Day War, it would have peace with the Arab world and the Palestinians. And the important thing about this hypothesis is that it was tested. A lot of people like to actually ignore that part because it's inconvenient. Sometimes I hear people tell a history that sounds like this. Rabin was elected prime minister. He tried to make peace. He was assassinated by a right-wing extremist. Netanyahu was elected and prevented a Palestinian state. The end. And what this telling of the story conveniently does is it jumps over essentially almost 2 decades in which 2 Israeli prime ministers, Barak in 2000 and Olmert in 2008. And in that sense, it's much more important than Rabin. Barak, only 5 years after Rabin's assassination, offered Palestinians what Rabin in his darkest nightmares did not imagine proposing. Sometimes people are surprised to learn that Rabin, on the eve of his assassination, his vision was to the right of what Netanyahu proposed in his Bar Ilan speech in 2009. So we had 2 elected Israeli prime ministers in 2000 and 2008 who proposed to Palestinians, basically testing the hypothesis, proposing a sovereign state, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites, end to the occupation. And in both cases, Arafat in 2000 and Abu Mazen in 2008 walk away from these proposals and to no dissenting voices among Palestinians and follow it up with violence. And in addition to those 2 efforts to test the hypothesis via direct negotiations, there was another effort in the middle of Ariel Sharon, a prime minister from the right, who pushed through the disengagement from Gaza, all the way getting out of the full territory of Gaza to the last square inch, removing settlements, removing graves, removing, of course, the military. And we know how that turned out. So you actually have a period of a decade and a half, almost 2 decades, when the hypothesis is tested. And that's really, really important to emphasize. And it collapses spectacularly. So I begin to ask a very simple question. What's the alternative hypothesis? What do Palestinians want? Because they clearly don't want an independent state. They clearly don't care about the settlements. They don't care about East Jerusalem. They don't care about the holy sites. And they don't care about ending the occupation because all of those things were offered to them. They were on the table and they did not take them. So clearly that's not what they want, because ultimately your actions speak to what you want. And as I do research and meet with Palestinians, and the research mostly is reflected in the book, The War of Return, I realize that they've always said what they wanted. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. If you go to the original Arabic, from water to water, Palestine will be Arab. So they're very clear that Palestine is to be free of Jewish sovereignty. Sometimes I use a quote from February 47 by the British foreign minister who explains the conflict, calls it irreconcilable, and basically saying that the conflict is between the Jews wanting a state and the Arabs wanting the Jews not to have a state. And that essentially becomes the alternative hypothesis that I test. The alternative hypothesis is that when Palestinians say from the river to the sea, they actually mean it. When Palestinians say that their top priority is for the Jews not to have a state, and rather than for themselves to have one, they actually mean it. And the thing about this new hypothesis is actually all the evidence fits. You actually do not have evidence to the contrary, and both in the actions and in the words of Palestinians. So this becomes the new reigning hypothesis until proven otherwise, that more than Palestinians want a state for themselves, they want the Jews not to have a state anywhere in the land.
And did October 7th play a significant role in reinforcing these points, not just for you, but for, for many people? And what about it in particular did?
Okay. So for me, it just is another, unfortunately, massive, tragic, violent, brutal piece of evidence that sustains this hypothesis, because the Palestinians were in control of Gaza, contrary to these fake memes about the loss of Palestinian lands. It's actually the opposite. This is the first time in the history of the Arabs of the land that they control territory. And rather than saying, okay, we finally control territory, the Israelis are gone, the Jews are gone, we're going to finally exercise sovereignty. We're going to turn this into the pearl of the Mediterranean. It's a gorgeous strip of land. It sits at the crossroads of two ancient trade routes. We know what they proceeded to do with it. They turned it into a fully integrated, weaponized landscape, almost unparalleled in history, for the singular purpose of, in their mind, liberating Palestine from the river to the sea. So, yeah, they faced a choice. And again, their actions and their words proved that it's more important for them to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea, so to ensure that there's no Jewish state anywhere, rather than to build a state for themselves. But it's true that after October 7th, many, many more Israelis are willing to listen to this message. I know that it's a tough message. It's certainly a message that not a lot of people wanted to hear. It's much easier. I know it's much more attractive and easy to believe that if we only got out of the West Bank, if only Bibi were not prime minister, if only there were no settlements, we would have peace. And to acknowledge that that's actually not a possibility, because the Palestinians want us to not have a state anywhere. I understand the desire not to accept it and not to believe that. But after October 7th, so many people felt that, just like I felt when, reality didn't fit with my hypothesis, then many more Israelis felt that reality doesn't fit. Even if you thought that, Israel should have been nicer or whatever, what they did was just so horrific that Israelis felt that you cannot explain it by saying, okay, Israel didn't give them enough work, or something else had to be at play, a more sinister or more total ideology.
Yeah, especially when also many sort of more peacenik leaning communities were the ones that were precisely targeted.
Exactly. And not
And
accidentally. I mean, when you have when you blow up a bus, you might have right wingers and left wingers being blown up in a bus. But the Palestinians, when they invaded Israel through Gaza, they targeted the kibbutzim. They targeted communities that they knew, intimately knew, personally knew, were committed to the idea of peace. On the eve of October 7th, actually, several of those communities were planning an annual kite show that was, the kites were to be flown so that the people in Gaza would know that the people in the kibbutzim want peace. So it's not as if the invaders did not know who they were pillaging and killing. They knew. And precisely because they knew, people needed a different explanation of what was going on.
So people in Israel seem to be waking up to this, and the first step of dealing with the problem is to be able to diagnose it correctly. What is it in the? It sounds like you were touching on it in your previous answer. What do you think is it in the psyche of people, politicians, the commentariat, where they're just unable to see what it is that you're seeing, and they are so much. They find the idea that really it's Israel that's the cause of all this, that it's all about a legitimate grievance and resistance. It's so much more appealing to them, and even an event like October 7th doesn't seem to have woken them up to that. I mean, I know you're not primarily a psychologist, you're a politician and an intellectual, but do you have any sense of what's going on?
So one explanation, call it the more benign one, is the one that people have been subjected to decades of propaganda, and as a result, they have completely warped understandings of who's the David, who's the Goliath, what the conflict is about. I would say that's the more benign interpretation. And then like you go to the psychological explanations that people don't easily move away from positions after they've been propagandized for decades into one position. That's in many ways the benign explanation. The less benign one, and the one that I increasingly have to give more room to, is the fact that people know what's going on and they very much want it to continue. So they have absolutely no interest in voicing different views because what's going on is exactly what they want to go on.
Interesting. Yeah, that it's a darker thought to think that actually they know exactly what they're doing.
Yeah.
But maybe that is indeed the case. And this actually brings me to the next discussion, which is about UNRWA. Now, you've spoken a lot about this before the general public or people that care about Israel were, clocking onto this as it being a key thing that needs to be dealt with. But now we've seen it being in prime focus, given that Israel has voted to have it banned. And we see people that, like the Britain's foreign secretary at the moment, who decided to reinstate funding for UNRWA despite funding, widespread complicity with Hamas on October 7th. But I wonder, what are your thoughts on the? First of all, I think it's worth just briefly summarizing why UNRWA it's so essential to be dismantled in your view. And secondly, what are your thoughts on what Israel's done and the global reaction and the political reaction that said, Israel's being highly irresponsible and all of that? And what do you think the message Israel needs to be kind of peddling in response to that?
Okay, so we're not going to do the whole talk. If people want to see, there's about half an hour briefing that I have about UNRWA that goes to the roots of it. There's also, of course, the book, The War of Return. But I guess the most important message is to understand that UNRWA sits at the original sin that allowed the Arabs, the Palestine Arabs, to avoid reckoning with the fact that they have been defeated in their efforts to prevent the emergence of a Jewish state, right? True to their goal of no Jewish state in any part of the land, the Arabs reject any plan of partition that will allow Jews to have a state, even if it's only on lands they reclaimed from malaria and desert, which are the lands that are allocated to the Jewish state in partition. And they go to a very brutal war with many scenes reminiscent of October 7th in order to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state. The Jews are able to ultimately repel those attacks and declare independence. This would have been a moment to accept the outcome, to basically say, okay, we tried. This is the outcome, and we're going to come to terms with the existence of a Jewish state. But rather than that being the case, the Arabs, and including the Arab refugees from the war, are indulged by basically being saved from reckoning with their defeat and being forced to move on with their lives. And they are allowed to essentially hijack a temporary mechanism that was initially created with all the best intentions to settle them, in order to actually ensure that they are never settled and they can funnel UN legitimacy and Western money in order to continue their forever war against the existence of a Jewish state. So UNRWA actually sits at the intersection and the original sin of preventing the Arabs from reckoning with defeat, with fueling and providing their hope that Israel will one day disappear, and thereby giving birth to generations of terrorist organizations and actual terrorists in the effort to undo the Jewish state. So UNRWA essentially kind of brings together all the elements of the conflict. The fact that the Arabs repeatedly refuse to accept the Jewish state, even when they are defeated again and again, that the West comes to their supposed rescue by preventing them from reckoning with their defeat, and essentially fueling them, both in terms of legitimacy and funding, in order to keep hoping that they may yet be victorious to their cause of no Jewish state. Now, that's basically what UNRWA does. And, as you said, it's been in the global attention after October 7th, because some people who are directly paid through UNRWA participated in the massacre. But that is not the interesting element here. If people had asked a different question, if people had checked how many of those who participated in the massacre, both the trained Hamas butchers and the so-called ordinary Gazans, how many of them were educated in UNRWA paid for schools? How many of them were registered by UNRWA as refugees, despite not being refugees by any international standard? How many of them live in neighborhoods that were misnamed refugee camps, despite the fact that they're not camps, they're neighborhoods, and no one there is a refugee? If you had asked those questions, you would have found out that it's everybody. That essentially everyone, or practically everyone, who participated in the massacre was either registered or educated or living in an UNRWA neighborhood, basically. So it's not just those who were directly paid by it. Because UNRWA is essentially the entire ideological infrastructure, fuel of the Palestinian war against the existence of a Jewish state. That's what it is.
Wow. So okay. So now your thoughts in terms of Israel's move to ban it, and to the world's response that has said, "Oh, this is so irresponsible."
Okay. So first of all, just to understand, UNRWA officially operates in 5 regions: Gaza, West Bank, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. Almost no one that UNRWA registers is a refugee by any international standards, but UNRWA registers millions and millions of people as if they're refugees. Now, until 1967, UNRWA does not operate in areas where Israel exists. After 67, it's a short war, vast victory, lots of new lands come under Israeli control. Suddenly in the West Bank and Gaza, Israel is in control of territories where UNRWA operates. It's a 6-day war, so very ad hoc. Israel agrees to essentially voluntarily cooperate with UNRWA. It's a voluntary cooperation that each side can withdraw in, and that's, it's basically a voluntary agreement, and each side can just stop it. But this temporary ad hoc voluntary agreement lasted for 57 years. With the completely mistaken view that UNRWA is a force for stability, that it does good, that it's the lesser of two evils. Again, Adi Schwartz, my co-writer, and myself went against this view that UNRWA is a stabilizing force. We said quite the contrary. It's the radicalizing force in the region. It fuels terrorist organizations, but the reigning view was that it's a stabilizing force and it's the lesser of two evils. So Israel actually cooperated with UNRWA for 57 years. But what happened since October 7th is, while the Israeli government and military, unfortunately, systems change slowly, remain still unfortunately wedded to the idea that, UNRWA is still the lesser of two evils. The people of Israel have certainly woken up to the extent that you can speak of a nation and a people. And as a result, what should have been a government action to voluntarily end this agreement with UNRWA became a Knesset vote. And the Knesset actually passed a law forcing the government to end this voluntary agreement. And what's important, and this was a vote by about 90 members of Knesset, wall-to-wall coalition and opposition, reflecting the new Israeli consensus that we will not collaborate with an organization dedicated to our non-existence, right? It's kind of basic, but even that very basic thing had to be said. And this goes to the issue of Israel's being irresponsible and all that. I would argue the opposite. The irresponsible thing was to fund UNRWA all these years. That was insanely irresponsible. And it actually is what created October 7th. Adi and I are on the record for years in lectures and meetings with officials in European capitals, telling them, you are funding something that we will pay for in blood. So funding UNRWA was actually the utterly irresponsible position. Now, you talked about psychology. There's a term in psychology called learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is basically when you indulge someone so much that they never develop skills for anything. They never learn how to do things for themselves. This is essentially the condition of the Palestinians on this issue. So what is this learned helplessness? Or what does it mean to defund UNRWA? And it's important to say, Israel is merely ending its voluntary cooperation. Israel is not in a position to close down UNRWA or to defund it. That's on the West. But what the Knesset vote did was to remove one layer of legitimacy that UNRWA enjoyed. UNRWA is not just the fuel of the Palestinian war against the Jewish state. It's also, what do you call the thing that you used to hide in the war, in the military, when you put something so that people don't know?
Helmet?
No, not
veneer,
helmet.
mask, helmet?
The thing that you hide, that's used to like blend with the trees, or
camouflage.
Thank you. So UNRWA is essentially the camouflage of the Palestinian war. It appears nice. It has the letters UN, and a lot of people fall for it. So what the Israeli vote helped do is just remove one layer of the camouflage, the one that said that Israel thinks it's a good organization. So at least now we've taken that off the table. The people of Israel have spoken, wall-to-wall, coalition and opposition. This is not a good organization. But let's
So
understand
it's not going to have any pragmatic effect.
Okay. I say that it has about the same effect of taking down Iran's air defenses. It's one more layer that allows to actually mount the more effective campaign to bring down the organization. But let's go all the way. Let's assume that we're successful and UNRWA is defunded. What does it practically mean? Once you understand that UNRWA is a purely Palestinian organization, except for a thin layer at the top of people who ask for money, then all the people who work for UNRWA in Gaza and the West Bank, they're Palestinians. They're Gazan-born, they're Ramallah-born, they've never left those places. They are the teachers, they are the administrators. So they're already there. You know, the allure of the letters UN is so powerful that people actually think that these are Norwegians and Swedes that have come to Gaza to help a suffering population. No, these are Palestinians born and raised in Gaza, of the from the river to the sea, liberate Palestine vision. That's what they teach. And they're the ones. Okay, so once you understand that defunding UNRWA doesn't mean that Norwegians and Swedes go home. Everyone stays. The teachers are there, the administrators are there, everyone is in place. So the only question that emerges is who will pay teacher salaries, right? That's at the end of it, that's all it is. And rather than enforce this learned helplessness, which always tells Palestinians, you never need to be responsible, we'll pay for you, you just focus on butchering Jews. How about, I want to introduce the revolutionary, radical, and original means of paying teachers' salaries. It goes like this. The Palestinians can run an economy, which we know they did in Gaza. They can then collect taxes, which we know they did. They collected a lot of taxes from the trade they had with Egypt above and below ground. And then they can use those taxes to pay teacher salaries. I know, original, revolutionary, and unheard of. Joking aside, when people say, what will replace UNRWA, or, you know, we need UNRWA, actually, the irresponsible thing is to keep UNRWA. The smart and responsible thing is to defund it, throw it away, and tell Palestinians, you are perfectly capable of managing your own affairs. If anything, we saw on October 7th that it required years of investments, planning, capabilities, strategy, financial and economic planning. The Palestinians are not some charity basket case. It's only learned helplessness. They are a perfectly capable people with screwed up priorities. Once they no longer prioritize destroying the Jewish state, they have all the ability to run an economy, collect taxes, manage schools. They're perfectly capable of that. No one needs to do it for them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a sort of a bigotry of low expectations we have in the West about this. It's always Israel's fault, and it's always Israel's responsibility. And I think what you say is so poignant. And I want to move on to looking forward now, and you know what happens next. First of all, there's been a consequential election in America, and you wrote a post recently talking about what you think this means. Before we talk about the next administration, the last administration, the Biden-Harris administration, what would you grade it if you were to give a Dr. Einat Wilf report card? I'm talking obviously vis-a-vis Israel and the Middle East.
Yes, exactly. just terrible, just awful. And I have to say, it pains me to say that, because I have no question that President Biden loves Israel dearly. As he himself says, he's a Zionist. That's true. I have no doubt of that. But his policies have been a disaster. And from the beginning, they basically almost undid all the successful Trump policies. You know, I've no problem if they undid unsuccessful Trump policies, but why did they undo the successful ones? They refunded UNRWA, no strings attached. refunded a lot of the Palestinian stuff, again, no strings attached, going back to indulging them, going back to this learned helplessness, basically telling them, oh, the bad era of Trump essentially holding your feet to the fire is over. Just go back and focus on what you've always been very good at, which is fighting Jews. Again, I know this is not what the administration intended to. That's not the message they wanted to send, but that's the message that they sent, even if it's not the message that they intended to send. They turned a cold shoulder to the Abraham Accords. They stopped a lot of its momentum. By the time that they decided they did want to pick it up, it was almost too late. And even after October 7th, as much as the United States stood with Israel and supplied Israel with weapons, they have, in their policies, again, I'm sure that was not the intention, but the effect was that in their policies, they actually prevented Israel from winning and contributed to the fact that more than a year after October 7th, Hamas remains entrenched firmly in power. And basically, the hostages, so many of the hostages are still in its hands. It refuses to surrender. And that's where we are. And so many, and the policies are based on a lot of, I assume they're goodwill and good intentioned mistakes, but they're still mistakes. The first one, my criticism is that Israel caved to it. The first one, if you remember, when Biden came a few days after October 7th, he gave a beautiful speech. He brought the aircraft carriers. We thought we'd be like slaughtered from every direction. We were deeply thankful. He talked about all the atrocities and the evil that was unleashed on October 7th. And then he went on to say, but Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians. And I remember hearing that and saying, oh no, we're going to pay dearly for that sentiment. Again, I know it's a sentiment that came from a good place. He wanted to show that he doesn't think all Palestinians are evil. But this was a moment, this is where I'm critical of my own side. I'm not American, I'm Israeli. I would have wanted an Israeli prime minister to stand firm at the time and say, thank you, Mr. President, for everything you're doing. We deeply appreciate it. Unfortunately, Hamas represents the Palestinians in the deepest sense of the word, because they represent the Palestinian ethos that prioritizes no Jewish state over building something for themselves. This is why there was so much exhilaration and euphoria among Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, around the world, among their collaborators around the world, and basically to say, look, we're going to treat Gaza as our enemy. Just like you didn't make distinctions between Nazis and Germans, between, kamikazes and Japanese, we're at war at minimum with Gaza. I say we're at war with the Palestinian ideology in total, but at the minimum, we're at war in Gaza. And we're not going to send soldiers to war based on a lie that Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians. And in any case, the burden of proof is on them. We would love to be proven wrong. Right now, all the evidence is Hamas is hugely popular. So the burden of proof is on them, not on us. So this lie created the crazy pressure, which also Israel succumbed to and caved to supply our enemy at a time of war in a way that's unparalleled, unprecedented. Basically, our enemy fights us, refuses to surrender, holds our hostages, and we're resupplying them. How does that make sense? I want to read you an email that it's essentially very, very short, by a colleague of mine who's not Jewish. And it basically reads like this. Can you please explain to me why Israel is responsible for the humanitarian conditions of a country they are at war with? During World War II, were we responsible to make sure German civilians got enough food and medical care? And then she has like 15 question marks. I mean, we have normalized so many bizarre things that we don't realize how crazy it is. And precisely because we agreed to play into the lie that Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians, and therefore it is Israel's responsibility to provide them with fuel, with water, with regular supplies from its own borders, the borders that were breached. And no one's putting any pressure on Egypt. You know, you see all these people in Gaza raising money to pay, I don't know, tens of thousands of dollars to bribe people to get out of Egypt. In every other conflict, it's understood that that neighboring countries, you know, all the neighboring countries in other countries have to open their borders to refugees. Egypt just reinforces the wall and everyone pretends that it doesn't exist. So many policies were wrong. Oh, and another one of my big favorites, treating Qatar as like some honest broker when Qatar has been 24/7 busy ensuring that Hamas stays in power. So all of these policies are a disaster after a disaster after a disaster. Let's talk about Lebanon. You know, treating the fact that Resolution 1701 was not implemented as just this is how things are. The fact that unprovoked, Lebanon, from Lebanese sovereign territory, Hezbollah attacks Israel unprovoked. What? It's, you know, people have accepted like, oh, it's in solidarity with October 7th. No, that's not in international relations a basis for launching an attack. So,
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, just so many things are insane, and yet the American administration normalized them. They even
and
normalized
not just the American administration, it's the conventional wisdom in the world.
Yes.
Right.
Sorry.
So no, it is. It's fascinating to me. I learn often religious Jewish texts as well with one of my rabbis, and there's a notion that the Jewish people go through these four main exiles, and the last one being the Roman exile, which is the one we have up until today, which represents the Western world exile. But there's an idea in Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism that will morph in the sort of the last stages to the Ishmaelite exile, the exile of the children of Ishmael, the oppression of some of the children of Ishmael, and it says in the Zohar, in the Kabbalistic text, that no exile and no oppression will be as oppressive. And I said to my rabbi a few weeks ago, I said, I mean, Jewish history has been pretty oppressive. Like, what have we got in store? That sounds horrendous. And he said, what it meant is, what's the oppression that's incomparable that we have today? It will be the psychological oppression, the guilt, the fact that we really believe we're guilty, and we've been convinced of these ridiculous, absurd notions that they're the truth. I want to talk a bit in briefly before we take questions.
If I may say something short on that, I don't know, you're young, but there's this famous scene in Good Will Hunting where
I've seen it.
Yes. So the name of the psychologist, the comedian who died. Sorry, it's late. I'm beginning to lose the
Robin Williams.
Robin Williams. You know, there's the scene where he tells again, what's the name of the guy that plays
Matt Damon?
Matt Damon. So he tells Matt Damon, it's not your fault. And it's this very moving scene where he constantly tells him, it's not your fault. Yes. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. And this is how he helps him to heal. And sometimes I feel that it's a bit of the role that I try to play with respect to Israelis and the Jewish people, to really release them a bit from the fact that they assume so much. We assume so much on ourselves, and like, no, it's actually not your fault.
Wow, I'm really moved by those words. I think that really is your role, to be honest, and I think that's an extremely noble mission. Just before we take some questions from the audience, and I invite you please to post your comments and questions in the Q&A, and we can I'll put them to Einat. But just where is Israel at now? You know, a lot has changed in the last few months. As I said, you know, the pager attack and Hezbollah, and you say Hamas are still in power, but from what I'm reading there, you know, a lot of their military might is being has been undermined. What also in terms of like where's Israel at now in the region? Also with the new Trump administration, what do you foresee moving forward? Just give us a brief sense of where we're at and what happens next.
So we're at a point, and I think in that the American administration and many of the nominations that have been made for the key positions will have a key role to play in almost also helping us believe in ourselves again, because despite all the military successes that we had, I'm still detecting a tendency to go back to the way things were before. Let's accept a ceasefire. Let's go to Resolution 1701 in the North. And I'm like, the resolution has not been implemented for 18 years. Why do you want to go, like, on what basis are we going back to that resolution? And I think the people of Israel are in a different place from our institutions. Our institutions still seem to be like not complete, still stuck. The people are clearly in a point where like, we're sorry. Now that we've seen, we know, we couldn't even imagine what they would do. Now that we've actually experienced what they would do, we're not going to allow this to just be built on our borders and then we go back and assume that a ceasefire will hold or Resolution 1701 will protect us. That's it. Like, we're done with these half measures. Now, I hope I'm not projecting my own views on where the people of Israel are, but the UNRWA vote for me is an indication, actually, that the people are in a different place than our institutions. Now, the president-elect said that he wants the war to be over by the time he takes office. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for us to say, great. In order for the war to be over, it needs to be over in the following way. Could you please go and give a speech that says the following? Dear Palestinians, given that in the last century you have devoted yourselves initially to prevent and then to undo the existence of a Jewish state in any borders between the river and the sea, it is time for you to accept that in that you have lost. And you need to use the title of a book about Japan that I quote a lot. You need to embrace defeat. You need to come to terms with it, and you need to move on. I am more than happy, as I did in the previous administration, to offer you a potential first state. But for that, you need to finally accept that you're going to live next to a Jewish state and not from the river to the sea. I'm also announcing that UNRWA is defunded forever, not just temporarily. I'm going to work with other allies to ensure that they defund it. I want to make it clear to you that you're not refugees. It's a scam. You possess no such thing as a right of return. Enough is enough. So if we can get the president to give that speech and to say, look, not a single dollar is going to flow into Gaza until you surrender. We're happy to take surrender from any volunteers. It could be the leadership in Qatar. It could be the Palestinian Authority. It could be Sinwar's brother. We don't care, but we need to see a clear surrender from you that says that you've ended your century-long war with Zionism. We will support you when we hear this message. Nothing will flow to Gaza until we hear this. And Qatar, by the way, we're forbidding you from giving money to any think tanks, to any universities. We're going to reconsider our military base in Qatar. We might move it to a nicer country, the UAE or somewhere else. And in general, we're not sure we want to protect your oil fields anymore. So I know I'm running with my imagination, but I actually think that precisely because the president wants to bring the war to an end, this is the opportunity to ensure that it actually ends the way it should end, and to make it clear that ceasefires is not an end.
Yeah. The only point of contention I'd have with that is I just can't see how in the aftermath of October 7th, Israel could ever risk granting self-determination, entire autonomy in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, because it just seems far too risky to me. Even if they claim we've changed, we now love Israel, it's just how could you risk that when there's so much there's such broad depth of and history of anti-Semitism in the Islamic and Arab world that it seems naive to me to think that's ever gonna just that couldn't have a risk of re-emerging.
The only difference is I don't think that it's a risk, because what I've seen, again, to the credit of Palestinians, they do not lie on this issue because it is integral to their identity and sense of who they are. So in many ways, the day that they actually let go of that is the day that
Didn't Arafat lie a little bit? Because he did dance a little bit to the tune of negotiation. I mean, what's he doing going to?
They will negotiate. They will. They can sign interim agreements, ceasefires. But if you delve and ask the questions specifically, they do not lie.
That's interesting. And what if they say no? What if they say we simply will not accept? Should Israel just accept long-term, occupation?
Okay. Then, first of all, as you can see, I'm all in favor of clarity. First of all, let's be clear. This is a state of war. There's not going to be ceasefires. We might go in, we might go out, but we're at war with you, and we're going to be much more active in ensuring that you can never build the capabilities that you build. And even the issue of occupation, I'm against occupation that does not come after surrender. Occupation needs to come after surrender, like in Germany, like in Japan. Then you can have an effective occupation that changes the schooling, that changes how things operate. But you can't have an occupation when you don't have surrender. Now, you can have many surrenders in the sense of, like, you can carve out a zone of Gaza, let's say in the north, and you can say this area will be for people who individually surrender, okay? If there's no total Palestinian surrender, it will be for Palestinians who are who basically are erased from UNRWA's books as refugees, who individually sign and record on tape a declaration that they no longer want return, they don't want from the river to the sea, they only want to live next to a Jewish state, they understand that they're not refugees, and only they can go in. Now, I've proposed that over the last year, and sometimes people told me, not, but you said that in your 20 years of working on this topic, you've only ever met 3 such Palestinians who will clearly agree to say, that's why I said they don't lie, that they recognize the equal right of the Jewish people, they're not refugees, there's no right of return. And they say, what if only 3 people will come? And I will say, wonderful, they can get the billions. Build each one of them a mansion. But let's reverse the equation. We've been indulging and paying for Palestinians to fight Israel for a century. That goes back to the darker thought. Maybe the countries that pay for that know what they're paying for. But let's try to reverse the equation. Let's actually only support, pay those who really want to live in peace. And let's see, maybe there's more than 3. But at least let's be clear on what we're supporting and what we're not supporting. And I think that there should be no occupation when there's no surrender.
But there is an occupation now and there is no surrender.
No, there's no occupation. There's war.
There's war. Right. Okay. So you're defining it differently. Got it. Okay. And Ambassador David Friedman came out with a former America's former ambassador to Israel, came out with a book recently, One Jewish State, where he's proposing apply Jewish sovereignty throughout the entirety of the territories, and you could have sort of like semi-autonomous zones, like you might have Puerto Rico and certain things that America would have as certain regions that are semi-autonomous. What are your thoughts on that?
I haven't gone deeply into it, but it's an idea that exists all around. It's not sure yet.
Right.
I need to
Fair enough.
see exactly what he had in mind.
Okay, For sure, for sure. So let's take some questions now. Please do comment with your questions in the Q&A box. Shari Gershenfeld has said, what are your thoughts on Elise Stefanik as UN ambassador, and supposedly just announced Mike Huckabee as US ambassador for Israel? That's news to me, actually. I didn't know that yet, but that's a remarkable announcement if that's the case. So Mike Huckabee and Elise Stefanik, what are your thoughts?
All in all, very positive. If Elise can bring the same kind of spirit that she brought to, the congressional interrogations of the university presidents to the UN, that would be great. The UN needs some serious shaking up. Nikki Haley was wonderful at the time. I'm sure Elise can be great as well. So I think that's wonderful. And Mike, in terms of Israel, again, I think what I'm getting between Marco Rubio and Elise Stefanik and Mike Huckabee, I'm getting the sense that, yeah, there is a general tendency to send a message to Palestinians of enough is enough.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I think is generally a very positive message.
Yes. Yona from Holz said, I've been listening carefully. I've not heard the word Islam mentioned even once. Given the number of Arab defeats, what do you think would be required to get religious leaders to admit that Allah simply isn't with them and they need to accept his judgment on this matter? A statement from the American president won't carry the flag.
But I'll explain why it will help. There's no question that Islamic history, sociology, Arab sociology underpins much of the obsession against the existence of a Jewish state. But it's also important for me to say that religious systems are generally systems of interpretation. Generally, they're not really from God. They're human interpretation systems. The best religious leaders are the ones that basically reinterpret religious texts and say, but that's what God really meant. So when people say certain things are Islam, are Arab, I say this is an interpretation. There could be other interpretations. There could be a pro-Israel and pro-Zionist interpretation of Islam. And by the way, defeats are part of how you reinterpret. The way that the question was phrased was kind of joking, but that's how it works. A lot of people say, oh, now the people of Gaza will be more radicalized. And I'm like, you really don't know history. It actually works the opposite. When your ideology tends to bring you to disaster, you rarely double down on it. It's typically opens a moment of questioning of maybe not the best ideology in the world. The tragedy is precisely that every time that Palestinians and Arabs could have had a reckoning with their defeats, they were saved from that reckoning. And that's why I'm interested in all the current nominations, because they seem to almost instinctively send a message of you've lost and it's over. Yeah. And we're nominating people who have no patience for your manufactured stories. Now, I do think that, projection of American power, a kind of enough is enough attitude can at least get a few Arab countries to begin saying, you know what, we want to move away. Right. During the Abraham Accords, I followed very closely what Muslim scholars were saying in those countries, like the Emiratis, Kuwaitis, Saudis. They began to say things like, but of course the Jewish people belong in Israel. Islam recognizes it. Now, of course, Islam recognizes it, but for the last century, we've had a different interpretation. And what I loved is that they said it as if of course, did anyone ever say anything different? Of course, Islam recognizes that the Jews have a history in the land. And then I remember when a few Muslim scholars began to say, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, it's not in Jerusalem. Nowhere in the Quran does it say that Al-Aqsa is in Jerusalem. It just means that it's at the edge. Who knows where the edge is? So you saw that on different circumstances, you began to see a different theological interpretation. So I'm not saying that an American presidential speech will do that, but nominations, speeches, actions that begin to send a message of enough is enough might create a few ideological cracks that begin to go in a different direction.
Interesting. Do you have a sense of what percentage of the Islamic scholarship world is sympathetic to those sentiments of, and sympathetic to Israel, and what percentage we still need to work on?
Oh, I would say almost no one, but it's clearly a minority voice. I'm under no illusions. But
right.
For the first time, it actually exists. So all I'm saying is that it's a possibility. You can say, it's like you bring Satmar Jews. Okay, so Satmar Jews took literally 3 words in the Bible that are about a love story. And, to use the name of a movie or a song, you can't hurry love, right? That's the quote. And they used the quote of you can't hurry love to say the Jews cannot settle in Israel until God wills it. This is really a remarkable act of interpretation, but it is an interpretation. And then other religious Jews interpret it differently. And both interpretations are Jewish interpretations. Right now, the Satmar interpretations is a minority one, but it is an interpretation. So all I'm saying, right now, pro-Zionist, pro-Israel Muslims are like Satmar Jews, right? It's a fringe interpretation, but it is rooted in Islam. It's not rooted in Islam, which at least opens the possibility of a wider acceptance.
Definitely. And I think the theological stuff is a critical component of this, if not the most. Last question from Sarina Kopinski. Could you please explain the news report about what Biden-Harris secretly implemented on election day when no one was watching to waive the sanctions against Palestinian pay-to-slay? Did this happen? What precisely happened? Can it be undone? Isn't it illegal per Taylor Force law?
I don't know. It's the first time I'm hearing of it. I doubt they can do it because I think it requires Congress. So apologies. Don't know enough about that one.
Okay, no worries at all. Well, the feedback from the other questions, other than asking questions, is just to say how much people have appreciated this interview. So, as always, Einat, it's such a pleasure to listen and learn from you. And thank you for all you're doing for the Jewish people, for Yisrael, and for telling the truth and reminding us that it's not our fault. This conflict is not our fault. It's so important to hear those words, and really, really appreciate your time. If you've made it so far in this video, I have a request for you. JTV has been having a really big impact in spreading the truth about Israel and creating positive associations with the Jewish people, Judaism, and Israel. We've really grown a lot, particularly in the last year, and we're having a really significant impact, both for Jews and non-Jews. But I really want to take JTV to the next level so we can start to compete with the other big online media beasts that are often peddling anti-Israel content. And the way we're going to do that is to scale even faster. So I'd love to build a team where we have other presenters doing shows like me. Let's start doing documentaries, supplementary content, animated content, etc., etc. And to do that, I'd like to build a bit of a team. So what we're going to do is we're going to do one fundraising day, just one, where we try and build up some funding in order to fund such a team. Now, to do that, it's going to obviously require people to get involved. And I'm wondering if you would consider, if you're watching JTV content and appreciate what we do and want to help partner with us in taking this to the next level and spreading the truth farther and wider than ever before, I wonder if you'd consider partnering with us simply by running a mini page on the fundraiser that we do, where you just reach out to your contacts on that day that we choose to fundraise and see if they'll all chip in. If you'd be up for doing that, of which I would be so grateful, then please click on the Google form link in the video description of this video, where you can simply just put in a few contact details. It'll be a very small commitment, as I say, literally just one day that we'll all agree upon as a collective community. But the impact is going to be so big. There's such strength in numbers. If we all pull together and do this, we can take this to the next level. And as I say, all of us can partner together in bringing and spreading the truth to the whole world. So please do consider clicking on that link, filling in the form, and I'll be in touch very soon to talk about the next steps. Small commitment, but a big impact. Hi, thank you so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.